I'm Mike Uyak. I love to try new things, and I've had culinary adventures all around the world, as well as right at home. I've had really wonderful food, as well as some really horrible food. I'd like to share some of my adventures with you, and we'll see if I have what it takes to fix whatever goes wrong. This is Recipe Redemption. Greetings, Redeemers, and welcome to this edition of Recipe Redemption. It's been a while since I've done a really vintage recipe, but I have to admit, it was a bit of a mystery for me, and I don't like it when I don't know its origins. It appeared on the label of a can of lima beans, produced and sold by Bursley and Company Incorporated, and that's about all I could get off of that label. This recipe was a bit of a mystery for me, and I don't like it when I don't know its origins. It appeared on the label of a can of lima beans, produced and sold by Bursley and Company Incorporated, and that's about all I could get off of that label. In my cursory search of the internet, I found mention of a G.E. Bursley and Company wholesale grocery house opening in 1880 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. It spread across a four-state area over the course of at least a 20-year period. Right around 1903 is the last reference to it I could find. I also found mention of a J.S. Bursley and Company, a cash and carry grocery operation incorporated in Illinois on February 1st, 1932. It's entirely possible this is a continuation of a family business, with perhaps J.S. taking over from father or grandfather G.E. Bursley, and just slightly renaming the company after himself to reflect that passing of the torch. It's happened a lot through history. I actually found a record indicating that this Bursley and Company went out of business in November of 1957. The last mention of it I see, well, last couple of mentions, is this particular location where this logo still exists on the side of the building, but they actually built this building in 1952, I believe it was 1951 or 1952, and by 1957 there's a record that there's another grocery store moved in there. So around November is when they actually filed for closure of the company. But I've been able to dig up more useful information about either business. So I'm not entirely certain when this can of lima beans and its attached recipe was actually sold. However, given that the baking instructions indicate a moderate oven, I'm fairly certain that it came from at least pre-World War II. By the end of the war, manufacturers were producing ovens with actual thermostats, so you could at the very least set the oven temperature with a decent amount of certainty within a 25-degree increment or so. Before then, oven temperatures were more of an art than a science. A hot oven, more often than not, meant that you could stick your arm in there and only tolerate the heat for about 30 seconds before having to pull it out. Alternatively, you could sprinkle a little flour in the bottom of the oven, and if it didn't blacken or burst into flames immediately, the oven was hot enough for bread, but not too hot. Some people did the same trick with strips of paper thrown in the oven. A low oven, on the other hand, what we would think of as between 225, 275 today, was basically hot enough for simmering things. If you took a pot of stew or braising meat or fish or something and put it in there, it would continue to slowly simmer but not boil vigorously. When the gas oven became more readily available, you could set them for low, medium, or high. They still didn't have temperature control. It was just controlling the flame intensity, which sometimes only meant how long that it would take for the oven to vulcanize your food. Temperature control was in some ways actually worse than before. Once modern thermostats came around, Converting recipes from the old, more intuitive means of temperature control meant simply defining a low oven as 275 Fahrenheit, a moderate oven at 350, and a hot oven being anywhere between 375 and 425, kind of depending on the manufacturer. This came with its own issues, but we can discuss that in another video because there's a lot to talk about as far as ovens. As for the recipe itself, it's a little dubious. Look at it. You're mixing bacon grease and peanut butter, smearing that together with carrots and lima beans, then adding milk, egg, a soupçon of grated onion, and some breadcrumbs and herbage, and baking it. That's it. And you could serve it with either a white sauce or a tomato sauce. I will say, based on the time period in question, this may be the result of Depression era food shortages. Making something akin to a meatloaf, kind of, when meat might simply not be available. I found other versions of this recipe that use dried lima beans, little bits of diced ham for flavor, soda crackers as the binder, sometimes using canned cream of tomato soup as the basis for this dish. I suspect, since the ingredients for this version of the recipe are just a half notch higher in sophistication, which is not saying much, I'm going to guess it's a later version. Perhaps one for those who actually grew up to like the Depression era original, but wanted to sort of spice it up now that nicer ingredients were available. Absolutely, totally a guess. And honestly, I don't know how this is going to taste. But you better believe I'm going to find out.
As always, I've reduced the proportions to a quarter to try and make one serving of this. I've already combined the bacon grease with the peanut butter, and I'm stirring it into the diced carrot and lima beans. Here's my seasoning mix along with the breadcrumbs, most of it getting into the bowl. Nice one. Stirring that together. That's a little difficult to measure a quarter of an egg, so I used liquid egg white mixed in with my milk, and it's a high enough fat content of my milk that I think it'll compensate for the lack of a quarter of an egg yolk. I think we'll be fine. And this looks like a fairly loose mixture, kind of watery, but I know that the egg white is going to set up, and the breadcrumbs that I've added need a little bit of time to actually absorb some moisture. I'm just going to pour this mixture into a ramekin and bake at 350 degrees for an hour. Okay, you may notice in the second half of this video that it's all done in voiceover, and that's because when I recorded this, I forgot to plug the microphone back into the camera, because I'm an idiot. So I'm going to try to do my best to remember exactly what I said. And now on with the show. So here it is, the Lima Bean Loaf. I chose to use a white sauce on this as recommended rather than the tomato sauce, and there's a very good reason for that that I'll get into in a little later. But in any case, it did come out as a loaf, sort of. Not 100% intact, and in retrospect, I should have lubed up the ramekin with some spray or some butter or something. But in any case, it did come out at more or less as a loaf. And it's actually the exposed surface, what was exposed to the oven, tended to be a little tough. It was actually a little difficult to cut through. But I managed, and you can see me sort of girding my loins to try this. The aroma of peanut butter is there, but honestly, the peanut butter flavor is kind of in the background. It's present, but it's not predominant, and that was kind of surprising. Peanut butter tends to be a very dominant flavor, but I think that's a factor that in a lot of recipes you put a lot of peanut butter in it, and this was just a little. So really it just added a little bit of richness, a little bit of sort of umami-ness to what is otherwise a lima bean and carrot dish. And that's the predominant flavor. The seasoning that you add to this really needed to be punched up quite a bit. This is honestly quite bland. It's it's kind of like just eating mixed vegetables, but in a more solid form. Um, Quite bland. The bechamel did add a little richness to it, which it really needed, but it's still not quite enough. Um, if nothing else, it just needed more spicing. But I think you can do other things with this idea, or at least with these ingredients. I think we can take most of these same ingredients, um, combine them in slightly different proportions, add a few more ingredients, and turn it into something a little more palatable. And the direction I'm thinking of going makes both a modern and a vintage dish. And what I mean by that is that ethnic cuisine, traditional ethnic cuisines, have become the new haute cuisine in America. It's now chic and trendy to actually eat traditional foods from other cultures, which is great. That is a great thing, as long as you don't tinker too much with the original recipe, with substituting too many of the ingredients. Yeah, you can fuck right off with that nonsense. So anyway, my idea is a Gambian peanut stew. And the fun continues. The batteries on my overhead camera decided they weren't going to hold charge, so I had to switch to the GoPro for the rest of this, which means you get to watch me wandering around the kitchen. Anyway, I'm sauteing some onions in some bacon fat, to which I am adding diced jalapeno pepper, minced garlic, and some grated ginger, and sauteing that for about 5 minutes, stirring continuously until the onions just start to brown. Then I'm going to add my spice mix, which is cumin, coriander, cinnamon, clove, and a good dose of mitmita, which is an African blend of spices, along with salt, and about 4 tablespoons here of tomato paste. Stirring those all together to coat all the vegetables in the tomato paste, adding a little bit of water just to make sure that it doesn't scorch on the bottom. And then I am adding chicken broth and some water, and it ended up being 8 cups. I'm making a double recipe of this from the original recipe. Stirring that all together, scraping up the bottom to make sure that I get any fond that had developed off the bottom before I continue, and it should look something like this at this point. To which, once that starts coming up to a simmer, I'm adding diced sweet potato along with the rest of my lima beans, probably at 28 ounces of lima beans for this, and I'm augmenting with some diced carrot. And don't worry, this is all going to simmer for a while, so those are all going to soften. I'm also adding some diced tomato, plenty of it. Trying not to add the lid of the can to the pot, but still get everything out of the can. And lest we forget the peanut butter, yes, adding some peanut butter. And for this big pot, it was about a cup and a half worth of peanut butter. And then simmering this, stirring continuously for about a half an hour. I stirred the soup occasionally to make sure it didn't scorch on the bottom, and at the half-hour point, the batteries on my GoPro died. So here's what happened after this. I'm ladling about a third of the soup into this saucepan where I have the leftover bechamel, and took a stick blender to it and blended it smooth, and then added it back to the soup pot. This is going to add a little bit more richness to the soup, and also loosen it up, just a little bit more liquid to it. I wanted it to be more of a soup than a stew. This does modify the original recipe a little bit. Hopefully I can be forgiven for modifying it by saying it doesn't change it that much. At that point, I brought it back up to a simmer, added some chopped up kale to this, as well as 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, stirred that all together, and then served it over a scoop of rice. And here it is, my Gambian style peanut soup. It's not really pretty to look at. I probably could have garnished this with a little bit of herbage on top or something, but No, I'm. This is sort of a proof of concept. I can refine this recipe later. Again, the aroma of the peanut butter does present itself, but it is still a background flavor in the finished soup. Um, that's very tomatoey. That is very tomato forward. The lima bean flavor is also there. It's detectable, but um, it's really only sort of you get little bursts of that flavor when you get an actual lima bean in your mouth. Otherwise, it's more of a sort of melange in the background with the blended lima bean. The sweet potato does add a certain body to it. It's really quite good, and although mitmita itself is quite spicy, the final soup is just spicy enough that you know that there's something there without it, kicking your butt. Um, Very, very flavorful, and the addition of all the different starches between the carrot and the sweet potato and the scoop of rice or other grain that you serve it over, it's very substantial. It's very filling. Yes, it is kind of high in carbs, but it's high in a lot of complex carbs and starches. So, it does take a little bit to digest this. It's not just plain sugars. Um, like I mentioned, this is kind of fatty with the bacon fat in there and the peanut butter. It's not, maybe not the healthiest soup, but it is very, very tasty. And I think it is, personally, I think it's head and shoulders above the lima bean loaf in terms of flavor, in terms of texture, and overall desirability. The lima bean loaf just seems kind of old-fashioned. Um, I recommend giving this soup a try, or if you want to leave it as a stew, to cook it up as a stew. Highly recommend it, and I'd like to hear what you think. So leave your comments below on what you would have done to improve upon the lima bean loaf. What direction would you have taken it? Leave it in the comments below. And as always, I welcome suggestions for other recipes that you want me to cook up here and see if I can redeem. So until next time, don't forget to like, subscribe, share with friends and family, and I'll see you next time here on Recipe Redemption. Thanks for watching.